Leonard raises all these big questions, no answers. Our paper raises a little question, but has an answer. But Leonard, that was a wonderful paper, and it's going to be a letdown to listen to my small question paper. Okay, what's the main issue I want to address in this paper? We're all familiar with the fact that during recessions, measured multi-factor productivity or total factor productivity drops, it becomes negative. So people usually interpret total factor productivity as improvements in technology, technical progress. But do we really forget our menus for producing goods and services during a recession? No. So what's happening is that we're traveling into the interior of the production possibility set. We can't fire our fixed factors fast enough to deal with declining demand. And so measured input doesn't go down as much as measured output. And so it shows up as a decline in total factor productivity. So what we're trying to do in this paper is develop a methodology to measure that particular factor. So the way we're going to proceed is to introduce a cost-constrained value-added function for a production unit. And then we'll be able to use this function to look at the growth of value added for a production unit, a firm, a sector, an entire economy, and break down that value-added growth into a product of 6 things. And so we'll have definite definitions for all of these 6 factors, which you can read there. Now, what makes this operational is to have some kind of approximation for the production possibility set that the production unit has at its disposal. You need that in order to implement this methodology. So the basic idea we're using is to look at past output supply vectors of the production unit, primary input demand vectors, look at their prices for outputs and for inputs, but the technology that we're going to assume the unit has at its disposal is the free disposal convex hull of past observations. So there is a little bit of a difficulty in getting this process started. If you just have one observation and then you move to the next period, you have only the 2 observations to generate your production possibility set. But of course, as you move on through time, you add more and more vectors to your list of outputs and list of inputs, and you generate a better approximation to the underlying production possibility set. So that's the idea in a nutshell, and then it's just a question of implementing it and seeing how it looks. Now, we take data from the US again, because recently the major statistical agencies in the US, BEA, BLS, and Census, cooperated to produce a set of balance sheet accounts for the different sectors in the US economy. And the 2 sectors we're going to focus on are the corporate non-financial sector and the non-corporate non-financial sector. The third business sector that they have balance sheets for are the financial firms. But there's so much disagreement on how to measure output and inputs in this sector that we said we'll leave that for others to work on. So we just do these 2 sectors that are more traditional. Yeah, so why the emphasis on balance sheet information? Well, a big problem with our system of national accounts, the flow accounts, is that we don't properly measure the costs of land input. And those of you who live in London know the price of land is an important determination of both production and consumption. So with the balance sheets there, we had estimates of the value of land and the quantity of land in these balance sheets. The only problem is that they don't really make that much sense. So we have to massage these data on the land component use other sources and try to come up with an approximation for what's going on. Now, what's going to happen when we bring land into the picture is that land input is growing relatively slowly, right? And so when you include it and give it a big weight, a big user cost weight, this will drag down your overall input growth and increase your total factor productivity. So the graphs that we show you will be a little bit different from the traditional ones that, say, Leonard shows, because we've got this land input taken care of. Alrighty, so the paper also looks at problems in aggregating over sectors, but that isn't our focus today. So just a little bit of notation. The vector y is the vector of net outputs of the production unit. So if it's producing the good, its component is positive. If it's using the component as an intermediate input, it's negative. So that enables us to deal with value added. Output price vector is going to be P. Those components are all positive. And then you have your primary input vector X, components positive, and price vector for primary inputs W. And we're going to assume that we can observe the outputs and inputs and the two sets of price vectors for this production unit over time. And as I mentioned, this set of accounts that BEA, BLS put together goes back to 1960, so we can have a good long-run view of the growth process for these two sectors in the U.S. economy. Right, so the period T production possibility set is the set ST, and we're going to define this cost-constrained value-added function RT for period T. It's going to depend on the technology set for period T, that's ST, an output price vector P that we face, an input price vector W that we face, and the primary input vector X that we're using. And so we try to maximize our value added subject to, so that's a choice of Y, and then a choice of input vector X. Those are the two choice variables. We're trying to maximize value added subject to Y and Z being in the production possibility set. But then we add another constraint that enables us to deal with the possibility of increasing returns to scale. We condition on the observed input cost of the firm in the period. That's the inner product of W with X. And then ask if we can optimize, choose a Z that will keep us in this budget constraint for primary inputs. Okay, so it's got a little bit of an aspect of a consumer problem built into it, as well as a output value-added maximization problem. So that's the basic function we'll be using. The ST set, I've described how we form that, just non-negative linear combinations of past output vectors, and then use the same linear combination of past input vectors. That becomes your feasible production possibility set. Yes, so now we get into our list of the 6 different factors that explain value-added growth. And ET is value-added efficiency. So the inner product of PT and YT, that's your observed value-added for the unit in period T. And you divide by this optimal value-added function for period T, facing the same price as PT, the same WT that the firm has, and the same XT that the firm has. But now you allow a firm to rearrange its production. If it turns out to be more efficient to use a combination of past input and output vectors, well, then you can do better. So the efficiency will always be equal to or less than 1. At a truly efficient point, this ET will be equal to 1. Just a footnote, with constant returns to scale, which we're going to assume, the model can be done for non-constant returns to scale, but it doesn't have enough bite to it. So if you want to get somewhere, you have to assume constant returns to scale. So that's a bit of a defect of the methodology. Anyway, if you have constant returns to scale, this value-added cost-constrained revenue function, net revenue function, has the form of input cost divided by value added unit cost function. I don't have time to explain what it is, but it does help simplify things along the way. All right, we've got our ETs defined. That's whether we're efficiently producing value added in period T. Compare it to what we did last period as far as efficiency is concerned. Take the ratio of the efficiencies, and that's our epsilon T, one of the factors that's going to explain the growth in value added over period T minus 1 to T. So basically, this thing will be mostly equal to 1 because for most periods efficiency will be on the frontier. The little ETs will be equal to 1. But occasionally during recessions we're going to fall below 1, and then as the recession progresses, are we getting closer to the frontier again or not? This epsilon T will tell us whether that's happening. Then we have a family of output price indexes. So this makes use of the value added cost constrained function, the R function. And if you look at the right hand side of this definition, it's a ratio of these R functions where the technology is held constant at period S. The input price vector W is held constant. The input quantity vector X is held constant. The only thing that changes are the output prices, PT in the numerator, PT minus 1 in the denominator. Those of you who know the Conius True Cost of Living Index theory will see that this is an analog to that, also to the output price index of Archibald and Fisher and Shell. Just got a few more things floating around. Just isolate the output price part, hold everything else constant, get a price index. And, well, you could do a Lesper's type special case of this. See, you've got a family of indexes here. Or a Pasch special case. In the Lesper's special case, all of the extra variables that aren't varying are set equal to the period T minus 1 values. So W is WT minus 1, X is XT minus 1, and the technology is T minus 1. So that's the first alpha LT. And then with Pasch, we just change around our exogenous variables to be the period T variables, and you get a similar index. And of course, we like Fisher, and so we take the geometric mean of the two to get an overall measure of output price change. And input quantity indexes, it's the same thing, except we have a very simple family of input quantity indexes. Just the inner product of XT, the period T input vector, with a reference input price vector W, and then use the same W in the denominator, but inner producted with XT minus 1. And again, we're going to get the special cases, Lesper's and Pasch. So choose your W equal to WT minus 1. That just gives rise to an ordinary Lesper's price index for inputs, and choose W equal to WT minus WT. We get the Pasch ordinary input price index. Again, we like Fisher, take the geometric mean. Input mix indexes, well, this is really the change in cost-constrained value added using the period S reference technology that's solely due to the effects of a change in the input price vector from WT minus 1 to WT, holding everything else constant. So this is kind of a murky thing, and it sort of boils down to the fact that as these input prices change, you might change the mix of your production. It turns out empirically this effect is nothing. It hardly shows up, so we won't worry about it too much. And then we have technical progress. Well, this is sort of a familiar idea. You have your RT function for period T, and you have it for period T minus 1. This is the maximum amount of value added you can produce, facing prices P, input prices W, have at your disposal input quantity X. Do the same thing in numerator, denominator, but in the numerator put in the period T technology set, denominator period T minus 1. And so, given the way we're going to do our technology sets, the technology set always gets bigger as you get more observations. So this family of technology indicators cannot be less than, it's always equal to or greater than 1, but it can't be less than 1. Okay? So this is where we're going to cut out the effects of recessions. The technology, we're not going to forget stuff as we run into a recession. The inefficiency is going to take over at that point. Okay, I'm running out of time. Global returns to scale measures. Well, this is just output growth divided by input growth, holding the technology constant and everything else except your choice of output vector y and input vector z as you choose stuff. As I say, we're going to assume cost returns to scale, so let's not worry about that. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we've got our 6 explanatory factors. And it turns out that we have exact decompositions using these definitions, 2 of them, a Laspers type decomposition and a Pasch type decomposition, where various mixtures of Pasch and Laspers indices kind of appear on the right-hand side. Take the geometric mean of these 2 decompositions, gives us our final decomposition, this one here, and that's the one we're going to use. Now, if we take the left-hand side of that equality, that's the value-added ratio. Let's divide that by our output price index. That will give us a quantity index, a value-added quantity index. And then if we also divide by our input index, beta t, then we've got a productivity index on the left-hand side, and then the remaining explanatory factors on the right-hand side. Right? So that's what we do for this last line, and we have 4 factors, but delta t is going to be set equal to 1, essentially, and the gamma t, the mixed thing, is going to be equal to 1, so it really boils down to just the 2 things, the change in efficiency term, the epsilon t, and the technical progress term, the tau t. So that gives us our nice decomposition. So here's how we actually calculate this cost-constrained value-added function. So we're at period t, and we have at our disposal now small t output vectors, ys, and small t input vectors, xs, and we take linear combinations of these column vectors with weights lambda s, use the same weights for outputs and inputs. We have the input cost constraint on the right-hand side, and we have our objective function maximizing value added as the objective function. And you can see this is a linear programming problem involving the lambdas with only one constraint, so we're at a vertex, and so we could just go through each choice of vertex and get the objective function and then take the maximum of those partial objective functions, shall we say, and that's the second line, which we use. The third line just factors out the wx because it's common, w.x is common to everything. And then the third line switches the max part, take 1 over the max, it becomes a min, and then that min part turns out to be this unit cost value added cost function. The cost of producing, minimum cost of producing 1 unit of value added if you face prices W and P and have technology T at your disposal. Again, not terribly important for our purpose today. Yes, I've talked about the BEA, BLS, Federal Reserve balance sheets, putting together the data set, and there's our 2 sectors. And here's how the stuff works out. Back in my decomposition, I just had the value-added growth going from period t minus 1 to period t. Well, we can accumulate those guys over the whole sample period and then plot what happens. And so it's easier to see kind of the trends there. And you can see where it dips down the green line, that's where we have inefficiency, and it's after recessions. So 73, we have a whopper, and then 79, second oil shock, a little bit of one here, a little bit of one here, and then the whopper in 2008. But the blue line is TFP as we measure it, and it never goes down. It just stays flat when we're in recessions and then picks up. So now we can isolate the effects of TFP growth or technical progress from the inefficiency part. So the green line in the bottom is the measure of inefficiency, and you product the two together to get the overall black curve, which is TFP growth. Now, you can see we had the big growth spurt in the 60s, and then we have this leveling off. But it actually looks pretty good for a long stretch. And I think that's because of the land factor. It just improves the productivity outlook. And then, of course, we have this flat spot when we're into the Great Recession. But interesting enough, the U.S., the corporate non-financial sector, has pulled out of it. Now, each year, I get my master's students to do this kind of analysis for an OECD country. And I had a very good student last year who did it for the UK. If you give me an email, I can send you her study, and you can see the comparable graph for the UK. And the UK never recovers to its level of productivity as we measured it from about 204 or 5. So, and that was the case for most European countries. The productivity kind of peaked around 204, 205. And for most countries, there's a huge gap from that level. France, England, Norway, you name it. But the U.S., boy, they just keep chugging along. Okay, now what happened with the non-corporate, non-financial sector? Well, here, the inefficiency gap is huge. So after the recession in 73, we don't recover that level until way here. Now, why is that? Well, because the non-corporate, non-financial sector is big on property investments. And so I think what happened is that property crash created excess capacity. Another viable theory is that there's tremendous mismeasurement in this sector, which I think is quite likely. I mean, this is a bit much, and so probably the measurement improved over here. But again, we have the U.S. economy pulling out of the Great Recession in a very satisfactory way for this sector. So that is about it. Adverse influence of recessions when output falls. You can't fire your fixed factors, so productivity goes down. Our methodology gives you a way of kind of quantifying this effect, and it's easy enough to do. It just requires the basic information that statistical agencies would have, prices and quantity vectors. My students do it for all OECD countries, or 25 of them anyway. And yeah, so that's it.